Welcome to our webinar for the launch of our new report, Next Stop Better Rail. I'd like to start by welcoming you all and welcoming our panel. I'll give them a brief intro now, but a bit more detail as people come to speak throughout the webinar today. We're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Crispin Cooper from Cardiff University, Stephen Joseph, a trustee from the Foundation for Integrated Transport, and John Davies, Vice President of Industry Relations from Trainline. And we're here supported by I Came by Train, a sustainable transport initiative backed by Trainline and supported by the Foundation for Integrated Transport, a grant-making trust devoted to promoting change on transport issues in the UK. A little bit of housekeeping up top is please feel free to use the chat, but if you're asking questions and you'd like our panelists to answer towards the end, please do put your Q&As into the Q&A function and thumbs up the ones that you're keen for people to respond, and I'll try and make sure that I send those to the panel when we start doing that Q&A part. And as for the running order today, I'm going to be kicking things off with a little bit of an overview of the project and the report and our recommendations. Then I'll hand over to Crispin Cooper, who will demonstrate the interactive maps that underpin the report and speak a little bit about the analysis. And then we'll hear a bit of a response from Stephen Joseph and a reflection on this piece of work before we give you all a chance to ask our panelists questions. So without further ado, I'll give you a bit of an introduction to this piece of work. So I imagine we're all here because we believe that rail travel has the potential to be transformational for regional growth, connecting people to economic and leisure opportunities, cutting transport emissions by encouraging people out of their cars for more journeys. And so adding that all together, it means that we think that rail can make us better connected. It can grant us access to the things that we need to be able to get on. It means that it can make our transport sector greener, which means it makes our air clearer and opens up the country for everyone, even those without access to a car. And we find ourselves at a once-in-a-generation moment for reform in our country's rail system, with new Great British Rail looking to be officially set up imminently and rail being nationalised over the coming years. Green Alliance's interest in reducing car dependency has developed through our previous work in this area, including previous reports like Not Going the Extra Mile in 2021, Moving On in 2023, as well as our recent output, Mind the Gap, earlier this year. We've shown in our analysis over the years that even with an ambitious zero-emission vehicle mandate, we still need to see the transport sector, our most emitting sector, being better on track to meet future carbon budgets and getting on the right trajectory for net zero. Unless we see a drastic change in pace with electric vehicles entering the fleet in the UK, then we're going to need to look beyond electric vehicles and improving the whole transport system so that we can reduce emissions by giving people viable alternatives to car travel. And so that links us to rail today. The reality is, many communities today are dependent on cars in places where the rail network can feel at times more expensive and/or slower. The mapping that Crispin's produced for our report supports this, at least as far when we're talking about comparing the price of train tickets against the upfront fuel costs of car travel. So not the whole picture when it comes to all of the costs of owning and running a car. We've supported this mapping with some policy research, and we use that to outline practical steps that encourage people to think of the train better and opt for it for more journeys. The first step, as we see it, is to set a target to grow rail use. The Labour Party committed to this before the election in their rail policy paper, Getting Britain Moving. And to get that growth in passenger numbers that we want to see, we highlight three key areas that can be improved in order to get more people onto trains. And that's affordability, improving connections, and better integration. So looking first at affordability, we agree with others like Campaign for Better Transport that there needs to be a national review of fares and ticketing to inform the new Great British Rail. This should include considerations on how to target discounts to reduce transport poverty in the UK so the people who need it most can access more affordable rail. In terms of number two, the connections piece, we say that rail requires capital investment to better support regional connectivity and increase the pace of track electrification to keep it steady, which has benefits beyond decarbonisation. And as for the third piece, integration, we say bus and train timetables should be better lined up. as well as better active travel infrastructure and facilities, linking people to train stations and making it easier to get to the train. As well as accessibility being a higher priority, we'd like to see a target to meet all passenger assistance requirements and more flexible space on board trains, which will benefit disabled passengers as well as people with buggies and suitcases. And so that's my very rapid whistle-stop tour of an overview of our policy report. And please do go ahead and read the report yourself after this. But as for now, I'll be handing over to Dr. Crispin Cooper. But just quickly, Crispin is a lecturer at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at Cardiff University, and previously a researcher at the Sustainable Places Research Institute. Crispin researches transport and broader socio-economic models, including well-being. He's created the model used in this report, whose findings are being presented today. And so, Crispin, over to you to demonstrate the mapping underlying this report.
Hi, thank you, Rosie. So I guess the background to this project actually starts with Trainline, who had been building a database they call Reasonable by Rail, which compares train to car times for all the trips for which Trainline sell tickets. So they also know how many tickets have been sold for each route. When we say route in this research, we mean a pair of stations. And this project started with us wanting to make something of this data. And coincidentally, as we're starting the work, the Office for Road and Rail also first released their own data for trips made between every pair of stations on the rail network. Now, the ORR matrix covers single trips. So as most journeys are returns, it doesn't record, for example, whether a pair of trips between London and Leeds were a return from London to Leeds or vice versa. So we used the Trainline data to expand that and proportion the likely number of returns in each direction, which adds value there. Initially, we started modeling this data to determine which routes have greater potential for growth, but we moved away from that approach as we know the Passenger Demand Forecasting Council and the DfT and local transport authorities can do that with far more resources than we can. So what we've instead done is taken to visualizing this data to inform a more strategic discussion of the potential of British Rail. So I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a moment. Here we go. So this is the new resource that comes out with this report, which is interactive maps of UK rail flows that visualize costs and times. So to give some examples, and we produced these in 3 columns, you can look at just principal routes, which you'll see in the PDF report. You can look at the routes that have the most journeys and the routes that have the most passenger kilometers, which is very relevant for reducing the carbon impact of rail. So looking at the start with the relative price of rail versus car, let's go on to this link here. And again, as with any of these maps, we have an interactive system. We can zoom in, we can look around. And we see generally by the color scheme here that most rail trips, it isn't a great surprise to see, are financially more expensive to the ticket purchaser than going the equivalent in a car, at least on the basis of comparing to the fuel cost, which is what, although it's not the full cost of running a car, it is what informs people's decisions for a single trip if they already own that car. Yeah, mostly on the red side with with rail coming in more expensive than car, and we can look at some details there, which I will come back to later. We can look at the relative time as well. So here we go again. Now time, what you'll see is a different pattern here, which is particularly for the high-speed lines in and out of London, that rail is often more cost effective than car in terms of time. It's these regional lines sort of between regional cities that don't sort of seem to exhibit worse time. For example, here, this if you mouse over this Manchester to Leeds trip, saying that it's 30% faster in a car, 36% slower in a car than it is on rail. Sorry, I've completely got that. Yes, 36% faster in a car than it is on rail. And what really jumps out from these maps, and I think a big sort of point of our report, is just how London-centric the entire rail system is. And you'll see like the width of these lines in this map show the number of journeys per year. And there's all these thick lines going in and out of London. What we see very little of, I mean, is trips between these regional cities, there's actually more trips, for example, from Liverpool or from Manchester to London than there is between those two cities, despite their close proximity, which tells us a lot about the London-centricness of the system. We've also produced maps here of generalized costs. So this is trying to bring time and cost together. I'll do this in terms of passenger kilometers to demonstrate the of course, so a generalized cost is basically valuing the user's time and bringing it into monetary terms. And of course, your value of time depends on what you're actually doing with your time, what the purpose of your trip is. And the Department for Transport publisher quite a range of values of time for different people and different purposes. We used for this basically the middle value of most of them, which is around £15 per hour. So again, we see slightly more interesting patterns here, and that's something you can look into in more detail and explore your local rail networks. One thing I did want to highlight, actually, going back to time of rail versus car, is one of the worst performers here. If you go to, oh, I don't think we'll see it on this map even, because it is so, it's not a popular trip. Let me look at most trips, time of rail versus car. Yep. Sorry. Newquay to Falmouth. So Newquay to Falmouth, I'm afraid, doesn't even show on this map because we have a filter to reduce the number of lines and the amount of complexity, showing whether we only display trips on this map when they are made by a minimum number of people per annum. Newquay to Falmouth takes, in the underlying data set, something like 2.25 hours on the rail system versus 45 minutes by car, which is why we're not seeing it here in this particular case. The other part of this I want to show you is actually a model from the last project we did with Green Alliance, which was called Moving On, Greener Travel for the UK. It's a strategic modelling tool. It's very rough, back of the envelope figures, but allows you to consider a wide variety of strategies. And it's called TRAFRED, our Traffic Reduction Policy Model. It has seen some minor tweaks and improvements for this project. And what's particularly sort of pertinent in the current case is if you put, for example, a 10% discount on rail fares, the model computes, and this is an economic model rather than a spatial one, but it predicts a 10% increase in rail usage, and as a result, around a 1% reduction in car miles driven on the roads. Rosie, that's the introduction of the tools surrounding this project. So back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Crispin. Really amazing to see those tools that were produced for the report and that previous one that's been improved. And I hope that people will go and have a go themselves at zooming around the map. It is amazing the things that you can see, especially zooming in between some of those urban centres. It's great fun to have a tinker with over the rest of your lunch break. So please do go and have a go with that. I'm now going to hand over for a quick reflection on the report from Stephen Joseph of the Foundation for Integrated Transport. First, a little bit of background. Stephen is also a transport policy consultant and a visiting professor at the University of Hertfordshire. He was previously the chief executive of Campaign for Better Transport for 30 years. He led campaigns to reduce major road building, to increase rail investment, and to highlight the importance of buses. He was even awarded an OBE for his services to transport and the environment. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Rosie, and thanks to Crispin for taking us through that report that's been done. So this is just for a few reflections, really. Firstly, the Foundation for Integrated Transport, it's a charity, it's been going for 10 years now, that makes grants for integrated transport. It was set up by a transport campaigner and mathematician, Simon Norton, and when he died, he left more money to the foundation. And we've taken Simon's mission to promote integrated transport, and particularly to reduce carbon emissions from transport, and also to promote transport as a basic right. The idea of being able to get around without having to own a car, which this project fits both of those. And we've done that, we particularly had a focus in the last couple of years on reducing traffic. So we've done that, and we've funded a wide range of projects, including the work that contributing to the work that Crispin and colleagues have done, and other Green Alliance work. I just make a few comments, and we've done various projects on rail. We part-funded work by Green Gauge, for instance, called Fair Britannia, on the case for a German-style public transport pass across the UK. And we also fund fellowships. So we've got a fellowship at the moment looking at ways of changing the business case for rail, so as to broaden the things taken into account. Just a few comments on this. Crispin sort of referred to this, but I think it's really important to emphasize this. Where the carbon is on surface transport is on medium car trips. There are lots of good reasons for reducing short distance car trips, and the government is in fact now endorsing that as an objective and transferring them to walk, cycle and bus. But actually, where a bulk of the carbon is on medium to longer distance journeys. A smaller number of journeys, but that's where a lot of the carbon is. So actually, rail is making rail better is really important. Secondly, the emphasis on integration. This is really important, not just integration between rail and bus and cycle and other modes of transport, but also between rail and the rest of government policy. And the report refers to work by the New Economics Foundation and others on the importance of linking rail to new housing development, a big thing in this government. That's important in terms of making rail in the future the centre for new development rather than as a sort of something that becomes very difficult. And another project, another group that the Foundation is funding, Transport for New Homes, has been looking at what is happening in that area. It's at the moment not very good in terms of new housing development being built around roads and cars rather than around public transport. A second point I wanted to make is the regional point. As Crispin said, there's the rail network at the moment and the travel is quite London centred, and that's true both in terms of intercity travel, but also in terms of the kinds of services that people get. And as the report says, there's some really important short-term things that need to be done away from the southeast. In the southeast, you do have sometimes relatively frequent rail services with long trains. And outside the southeast, some lines have a couple of carriages every hour or half hour going around, and actually adding more carriages, lengthening platforms, which has happened in some places. East Anglia has seen some new trains, newer, longer trains, which are also accessible. That is, that kind of enhancement of frequency and capacity on non-London rail services, both cross-country kind of intercity services, but also on regional services, is really important. And the other point I wanted to make is that there is some good practice around the place, and somebody in the chat's already referred to the Mid-Cornwall Metro, the Mid-Cornwall Metro, which is being developed now with new extra services going on to Newquay, but also Transport for Wales, which has now started to put in its Tros-Cymru long-distance bus networks into the rail journey planning, so that instead of telling you to go from, say, Swansea to Aberystwyth by going via Shrewsbury, it tells you to take a Tros-Cymru bus and can actually book through for it. And there are other things that Transport for Wales and other devolved administrations and authorities are doing that actually show what you can do in terms of improving rail and making it a real alternative to car for more trips. Obviously, extra reopenings, extra trains, lines, stations are also important in this, and it's currently quite difficult to do that. though we have seen the reopening of the line to Portishead probably happening in Bristol, but others are proving difficult. So I think that those are some sort of immediate reflections on this report, and I'll look forward to joining in the Q&A after this. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thank you for your support for this project. It's really appreciated. And actually, I will immediately invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on, at which point we're being joined by John Davies. John has worked in the rail industry for his entire career, working for British Rail. Previously, he works with Trainline stakeholders across the industry today, but his specialism in recent years has been on the development of mobile ticketing in particular. So welcome, John, and welcome to all of our panelists. I get to first enjoy Chair's prerogative and ask the panelists some questions of my own before we head to some Q&A from the chat. So please do be putting any questions into the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will send them to our panelists. But firstly, I wanted to ask each of our panelists, or jump in the most enthusiastic to answer first, is how can rail reforms like the establishment of Great British Rail help to address regional inequalities in the transport system, some of which we've been seeing in that mapping demonstration by Crispin earlier?
Would you like me to have a go at that, Rosie, to get us moving?
Please, over to you first, John.
Cool. So I think clearly we're at an interesting moment in the industry's history as we contemplate the creation of GBR and the objectives that the government is setting out for the creation of GBR, including, I guess, an aggregation towards the centre of the way in which services are organised and operated and delivered, and the rationalisation, I guess, of policy and strategy in those frames. And I think what's going to be interesting is to see how quickly that can all be made to happen, because, of course, there are not insubstantial organisational challenges to be overcome to get that to come to pass. And I guess our challenge stroke opportunity for the complicated industry stakeholder matrix at this moment in its time is, how do we continue to make the industry a better place for customers that want to use it between now and whenever future structures start to take effect? If we have, let's say, a rolling programme of nationalisation that's going to take sort of 3 to 4 years, maybe longer, and the creation of a GBR that may stand up in the same time frame, what is it that can be brought to bear before then? Because candidly, some of the things that need to be made to happen to make the industry attractive, to make rail interesting to people as a modal choice, cannot wait that long for those things to be delivered. And I think the industry should be seeking out the opportunities to deliver in a couple of different dimensions. How do we think about attractiveness? But I think we think about trust and simplicity and convenience and value. And those are all different ways of expressing the value for money paradigm that is at the part of the report. And I think that there are things that we can do now to improve the way in which customers are able to enjoy trust. So, for example, improving their accessibility to things like delay repay. So if the train journey I make is delayed significantly, that I can freely get access to my delay repay entitlement. I think simplicity is an interesting one. There's a clear kind of back pressure to get on with the job of reforming the fares system. And that's a massively complicated task. And yet, parts of the way in which policy seems to be being developed is involved in the increasing balkanisation of the fares system around the country. So when I hear about Manchester wanting what London's got in terms of its development of pay-as-you-go, my heart sinks a little, because I don't want what London's got for the rest of the national network. I want people to be able to travel around the national network freely and without hindrance, and without having to know how the ticketing system in Manchester differs from that which is in Birmingham or in Merseyside or in London. So I think there's a balance to be struck there in terms of resolving the needs of devolved administration who want to make the world a better place for their local constituents, but also ensuring that they still continue to think more holistically, or are guided more holistically as part of a national network. And that will improve convenience, and convenience and simplicity are known attractors of people to the rail network. So there are things that can be done now and do not rely on the creation of GBR to make happen in order to improve the attractiveness of rail as we go.
Thanks, John. Yes, I agree. It is a tricky balance when we're thinking about rail between the things that we need to see happen in the short term and building towards a better overall picture in the future. Stephen, do you have a take in response to that about rail reform, including Great British Rail and beyond, that can improve that regional inequalities piece?
Well, I've already said that I think needs to be a focus on improving journey times and frequency and capacity on some non-London services. That isn't to say that the London South East services are great, but there are some things that could be learned from those. I think the simplicity point that John made is really important. I think I don't think you have to worry too much about the sort of Manchester-London thing, because I think if you look at, say, what the Scandinavian countries have done, say Denmark and Sweden, they've created a sort of system of islands and bridges. So you have islands of zonal fares around places like Copenhagen and Malmo, and bridges between them, which can be intercity fares. And so I think you can have simplicity and have multimodal zonal fares in city regions. But I think the problem is that both industry and government modelling doesn't give priority to simplicity. It tends to give priority to kind of complexity on the basis of user choice, with things like 55 million fares on the rail database. Well, that's great because it means there's a good one for somebody there. And actually, simplicity does drive business, but it's not always picked up in business cases. The other point I wanted to make was about integration between rail and the wider world. I'll mention this briefly, but I think one practical thing that needs to happen is to make Great British Railways a statutory consultancy in the land use planning process in the way that Active Travel England is, so that it gets to comment on and influence land use planning, so that new development happens around railways rather than just around roads, which is what happens too often at the moment. So that's a practical thing that I think GBR could do and will make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I totally agree. I think we saw Rachel Reeves say that new planning developments should be prioritised around existing rail network. But I think that extra step of making Great British Rail a statutory consultee could help further with that. That's certainly something that we want to see. It's especially hard to get new towns with a sufficient sustainable travel mode share when you build them. So that's something that we're also thinking about in the background. John, do you have a response to Stephen's take?
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to support what Stephen had said about the Scandinavian model of islands and bridges. And of course, that has a lot of currency in the way that Transport for London used to think about the same sort of thing. And I think the point for me is, at the moment, there's a lot of focus in the conversation on the islands. So what are the plans for West Midlands and Greater Manchester and other parts of the network? And yet very little clarity on what the bridges part of the conversation needs to contain, and so there's a slight imbalance. And so I agree that you can have the best of both worlds, and indeed you probably should have the best of both worlds, because I think that by devolving transport matters to local authorities, you give them the relevant amount of control to exercise for their constituents. But the bridges part of the conversation is often missing. And one of the things that's quite striking, and giving away my age slightly, is that when the industry was privatized all those years ago, there was a lot of use at the time of the phrase network benefits, of the importance of remembering that the fragmentation of the industry into a number of different franchises should not mean that the industry was carved up into parts of the network that didn't have any ability to think of a joined up whole. And I think that that construct still remains very relevant today, and we mustn't lose that in the islands and bridges conversation.
Mm. Thank you. That's very helpful. And I also think, yes, when we were thinking about recommendations for this report and about the role that Great British Rail will play in kind of unifying decision making, but it's also at this time when we're seeing greater devolution around England, and so we'll be seeing ambitious regional leaders. It's how to make sure that decisions are unified, but also devolved leaders can make ambitious choices that encourage mode shift. And so getting that balance right is really interesting. It will be interesting to see how that plays out in coming years. Crispin, do you have any take on the encouraging regional inequalities piece from the mapping perspective?
I mean, less so the regional inequalities, but I mean, I think one thing we looked at in this whole report was, and we have to put it out there in the open. There's an elephant in the room here, which is that rail is expensive, and you know we can't get away from that. Now, at the moment, the business case for rail is mainly justified by the fact that it relieves traffic from the road in major cities. So it doesn't take much effort to imagine what a nightmare it would be driving in any of our major cities if all those rail trips are being made by car as well as the existing car trips. Now, you would think that once we factor in the cost of carbon emissions, that there'd be an even greater business case. But the trouble is, it doesn't make, on the basis for the current social cost of carbon that the government wants to use, it doesn't add a lot to the business case over the congestion benefits. So that implies that there must be cheaper options out there for reducing our carbon emissions, in which case you just have to ask the question, well, where are all these cheap carbon reduction technologies? Why have carbon reductions not been made already? Why are we still on track to miss internationally agreed carbon emission targets? So coming back to what you can do in the short term, I mean, reducing rail fares, it's not cheap, but then we're failing to reduce carbon in other ways. And you can do this overnight, and it would have people using the roads less within a month. So it is something rail can offer, and it is a comeback to the cost that if there is this political sort of opposition to that cost, it's like, well, where are these cheap carbon reduction options that are implied by the carbon price?
Thanks very much, Crispin. That leads me on to the next question that I was going to ask the panelists, which were, how do we balance making rail affordable and attractive while also tackling the revenue gap in the rail system? Who wants to take that tricky, thorny one next? John.
Everybody wants to talk. Everyone wants to talk about rail fares, don't they? So I think in the end, what is not to like about cheaper train fares, right? Everybody would like to see cheaper train fares, but of course, we all know that coming up rapidly behind that sentiment is that the fares policy set by government is a trade between what people pay for train fares and other spending priorities. And so it's not always necessarily about the absolute cheapness of train travel, but the ability to make rail travel more attractive than the alternatives, which I think is very much the thrust of the report. So the ways of doing that are about the trust and simplicity that we've talked about presenting customers with the right options, about improving the modal connectivity, about helping customers make the right choices when they get to their end destination, making good first and last mile modal choices, and those sorts of things. And frankly, those are the places where I think we need to go, improving the operability of rail as part of a not so much a multimodal construct, but an intermodal construct, understanding how people can make better end-to-end journeys, using rail as a central component of that, but being able to make rational choices at the end, which then in turn reduce the attractiveness of just simply jumping in the car and driving. And I think data, as Crispin has showed already in the session that we've had today, can really help that, understanding the journeys that people are looking for but can't currently take, understanding the impact of price on demand and elasticity for certain journeys. And there are other ways in which the industry, I think, could stretch itself a little, which is to say, I don't know to the extent that this is still true, but it used to be the case certainly that the across the network the average train was 50% full. Clearly, there are parts of the network which are extraordinarily capacity constrained and where demand handsomely outstrips supply. But that is not the case everywhere. And if it is the case that average load factors are around 50%, well, what is it in the way in which the industry is able to sell to consumers that needs to be improved to make sure that those load factors are increased and make people more encouraged to travel by train? And we don't really think enough, I think, about bringing people to rail as an active retail construct. I think demand for train travel is often referred to that as just demand, like it's a passive thing that cannot be influenced in any way and that somehow should be just expected to turn up. Where in actual fact, we know, don't we, that you have to sell rail travel in order to promote the benefits of it over other modal choices. And unless you do sell rail travel, then people cannot be persuaded to use it. And selling things to people who have bought before or have bought something similar before or can be encouraged or incentivized to buy something almost similar, but again, is an important part of kind of what we do at Trainline, creating imperatives for people to travel. And the data story is very important in all of that.
Thanks, John. Stephen, can I get your take on the thorny issue of the revenue gap in rail?
Well, I I think there are things that can be done to make some rail travel quicker and without across the board fares reductions. So you can, for example, look at extending the existing rail cards system that currently, you've got some which is like a lot of the fare system, sort of fossilized from the British Rail days. I mean, the rail operators have put in the two together card and the 16 the 23 to 30 card. So there have been some innovations, but there are opportunities to make the rail card system much broader and reward frequent travel in the way that the airlines do. Through national rail cards or through business travel. One thing that hasn't happened has been a single point of contact. I think Trainline do some of this for businesses who want to send people around the country. It's left to individual travel agencies to do that kind of thing, but the industry isn't working with businesses. I've been quite keen to revive an idea that turned up and then disappeared in the transport decarbonisation plan from a few years ago of a Commute Zero council that would bring together businesses committed to reducing their carbon emissions from commuting and business travel, and working with them and giving them discounts on rail would be a really helpful way of getting people in. But as I say, generally using the rail card system and building on that. The other thing, in terms of end-to-end journeys, I do think I've noticed one or two comments in the chat about, well, what do you do about poor bus connections? Well, I think another part of the government's reform agenda, bus franchising, can be used to make bus rail connections much better and to guarantee some of them in the way that does happen in a few places, but not routinely. And we should, there are opportunities there, including in rural areas. I know there's a sense that bus franchising is an urban thing because that's where Andy Burnham's been going with it. But actually, I think there's there are good opportunities for doing forms of rural bus franchising, which would make a big difference in terms of the kind of quality of bus services in rural areas as well as in urban ones. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Absolutely excited to talk about buses. That was going to be the next question I asked you, so that was a wonderfully smooth transition about how we better line up public transport integration. I know we talk in the report about linking up timetables, but I think also some of that route coordination. And I wonder if I might be saying what Crispin is about to say in more detail on that bus train linking up.
Sorry, I wasn't going to talk about bus train linking. I was going to emphasise Stephen's point about rail cards, actually, which is something we raised in the report, and that's something a specific proposal we made. Is for a means-tested rail card, and that's a win-win really for two things. One is transport equity and providing access to the system for people who can't currently afford it. But it's also a win in terms of using currently empty capacity on lines. Now, if you try and get more people onto rail, as I already suggested, by lowering ticket prices, that's lovely. We'd love to give a discount to everyone, but it obviously has an impact on the public purse. If you give a discount to people who currently aren't using the rail system, you're not losing out financially, and that's the win-win in the means tested side. Rosie wanted to talk about integrated transport, sorry, and so I wanted to throw in a quick one that we did a review of research for the previous report, moving on greener travel for the UK. And found on average that when you have integrated ticketing systems, that is sort of, you can buy one ticket that covers your bus plus the rail connections, all in one. The timetables line up. There's maybe integrated information provision throughout that system as well. On average, there's something like 10%, 10 to 15% increase in use of that public transport system in places that have implemented that sort of system.
Thanks, Crispin. That was exactly the nugget of data I was hoping that you would share. I think it's 14 from the report from memory.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And that links to a question in the Q&A function from somebody who is asking just along these lines. The integration of rail with local bus networks is also not good, especially outside of metropolitan areas. This tends to discourage people from even considering trains. How can we significantly improve it? And like Stephen and Crispin suggest, I also really think that part of the challenge there is lining up those timetables and also thinking about routes. And I do optimistically hope that increased franchising bus services around the country at the same time that we're going to see Great British Rail will end up with better coordination across those two pieces. Does anybody have anything to add on that integration point? Or do we feel that we've said all we need to? That's fine. Then I have another question here in the Q&A function, which is, it's been really interesting to hear the examples raised so far from other countries. Are there more that can be highlighted where the rail system does a good job of getting people to choose train over car? I know that while I was researching for the report, one of the things that I saw was in France, the rights-based approach where you have a right to affordable public transport. That's quite interesting. And of course, we've mentioned briefly the €9 ticket that was trialled in Germany, although that did eventually go up to then, I think, €49.59. But there have been lots of different ways to trial increasing rail uptake. Does anybody have any other international comparisons that might be interesting to draw? Crispin, is it your hand?
I know, again, I want to contextualize the costs here because the German system, I forget the figure, but it cost the German treasury, I'm thinking something like 5 to 10 billion. It wasn't cheap. And that's just, we need to set expectations like that in the West, these things do require money if you're going to do things like that. And it's not just Britain being rubbish. The rest of the West has the same problem, I think, by and large.
So brilliant point there from Crispin and John.
It's a slightly adjacent point, but related in terms of the sort of the European experience. And I'm not saying that I have the answer here, but I just wanted to table the topic for maybe discussion or just acknowledgement, which is that we seem to be approaching an interesting moment with the creation of GBR about how does the industry, the future industry, think about the role, for example, of open access operators. And of course, depending on who you talk to in the industry, open access is either a very positive thing or is operationally hugely inconvenient, and there are ranges of opinion across the whole spectrum. And I think if you look at the experience of the East Coast Main Line in particular, you can see, the existence of 3 open access operators in Lumo and in Hull Trains and in Grand Central. And I think what they have in common is that they have developed passenger flows, service groups that would otherwise not have been served by the incumbent operator. And in the case of Lumo, serving a different type of market, an airline style service proposition, let's say. And they seem to be doing quite a good job of it. They seem to be reasonably successful. Their trains run at reasonably high load factors. And dare I say it, I think the existence of that kind of competition on the East Coast Main Line is also holding the incumbent operators, LNER, to a decent standard. I think that LNER makes commercial decisions and timetabling decisions and pricing decisions in respect of the fact that there are other operators that it is competing against. And so we can say that in those parts of the network, competition has had some important benefits. And we see these benefits in also continental Europe, where For example, in Spain, thinking about, I don't know, a primary flow like Madrid to Barcelona, you have 4 or 5 different train operators using track access capacity that has been offered by the government and bidding for track access capacity in order to be able to offer up different types of service model at different types of price point to different types of consumer. And so this is all in the vein of just offering propositions to people that people want to buy. And it's relatively nascent stages of kind of maturity, but it's a different model than the one we seem to be currently running towards in the GBR conversation, which is it's quite hard to think about the role of open access in the network that we have because it's so capacity constrained, particularly at major junctions or stations or pinch points, and therefore the weight of opinion seems to be moving slightly away from it at the moment. So I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm saying I think that open access has delivered some good benefits for consumers in terms of making rail travel more attractiveness. And that seems to be being borne out by the experience of development of open access more broadly on the continent. So just let's be thoughtful about how we take that discussion forward.
Thanks, John. That's really interesting. And Lumo is one of the case studies that we highlight in the report, as well as Transport for Wales that's been mentioned before. And I'm seeing some lively conversation about Cornwall in the chat. And we also talk about the Cornwall Metro, just a quick case studies in the report plug there. I have another question from the Q&A that I'd like to put to you, which is regarding the expensive rail. How should we alter the tax system to increase incentives to take trains instead of driving? This is something Green Alliance has looked at before. If I can put a shameless plug in for previous reports on the transport tax system, I think there are 2 on our publication page. And I know previously we've talked about, as we see more electric vehicles come into the fleet, a reduction in revenue for the Treasury in terms of fuel duty. And it means that we're going to need to have a look at some other models of creating revenue from transport, perhaps pay per mile. And we're also seeing an increase in things like air pollution, congestion charges. And so it will also be interesting to see what role they have to play in terms of making car travel less competitive when it comes to that direct comparison for cost against train tickets that we've been seeing the mapping for here. Does anybody else have any takes on the transport tax system and how it might feed into part of this conversation about rail versus car competitiveness?
So let me have another go, Rosie. I mean, I think that this is very close to the broader macroeconomic discussion about, well, what is government policy as far as rail fares are concerned, and I guess the share of industry costs that government expects to be borne by the fare box as opposed to from taxpayer subsidy, let's say. And I think that it is clear that the balance of that has moved significantly towards the fare box and away from subsidy over a period of time. So in the end, it's a question of, is that the right policy choice for government or not, and does it need to change? I think that it is hard to feel, or hard not to feel, that rail kind of gets dealt a bad hand there sometimes, because the way in which the fuel duty has been frozen for so long, and yet fares policy means that train tickets rise in price relentlessly every year, and the same thing is true of air duty domestically to some extent as well. So again, all of these things are finely balanced, and they are all the result of conscious policy choices, and one wonders whether making those policy choices slightly more in favour of rail and slightly less in favour of road and things like fuel duty could have the kind of positive impacts that we're seeking.
Thanks very much. And Stephen, I know this is something that both Campaign for Better Transport and Foundation for Integratory Transport are thinking about regularly, this competitiveness of road versus rail. What kind of tax changes might we see that might encourage people to favour rail over car? Oh, sorry, Stephen, you're muted.
Sorry. Clearly, the issue of road user charging, fuel duty, and so on is important. We've seen fuel duty go down while public transport fares, particularly rail and bus, have gone up. so while you've got motoring getting cheaper, or the tax on motoring getting being reduced, and the cost of rail fares going up, it's not surprising that people choose to drive in some cases. But there are other sort of smaller tax things that really get in the way. For example, employers can't offer season tickets on rail to their employees, or rail and bus for their employees, because that's taxable. But company cars are taxed differently, though they are taxed, but they're taxed differently. And there are some niggly things as well. We discovered that if a leisure provider, like some kind, like for instance a park or something that attracts visitors, offers a joint ticketing offer to get people from rail to travel by rail and bus to its to see it. I think this came up with the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust in Gloucestershire. Then that would attract VAT. If they charged the fares separately, it wouldn't attract VAT, and it but because it was attached to the visitor travel, it did. So there are some mild things like that in the tax system that mitigate against rail. So there are things like that, and as I say, business travel and the way business and commuter travel's taxed might be worth a look. And if there are a number of places that do allow forms of public transport to be treated as a taxable, as a tax-free benefit for employees. Ireland does it. The US does it. So there are things there that could be looked at. FIT has just funded the restart of a transport taxation group to bring together people with an interest in reforming transport tax across the piece, separately from the discussion going on road user charging. Thank you.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you, Stephen. Some big food for thought there. I'm also really interested in the role that commuter emissions could play in this, and can't wait for Foundation for Integrated Transport to solve the transport tax system. Looking forward to seeing what that does in the future. I move now to a question in the Q&A that says, if a train journey involves 3 or 4 train changes, does research suggest any different ways of addressing the late arrival, late departure problem, i.e. misconnections? And I wanted to ask you this, Crispin. I know that we did have look at delays and the impact on demand in the rail system as part of the report. I wonder if you might shed a bit more light on that.
Yes, absolutely. It stands to reason. If people see a route with multiple changes, then we all look at that timetable and think, what are the odds of me making every connection? And so yes, and the latest evidence suggests something like now on average, a train in the UK is something like 3 minutes late, and that is average performance minutes, which counts a cancellation as 1.5 times the time you had to wait for the next train. So that sounds like a small average, but of course, what it looks like in reality is most trains roughly on time, and then a few, the ones that are very late, and you miss all your connections. Which means that I think for every halving of that lateness time that can be achieved, we expect to see gains of quite a few % in the number of people using the rail system. So of course it's something we try to address if we can, and there are more sophisticated models out there that will that take the number of interchanges into account in people's mode choice. Is not something we used on this project, but there's definitely evidence out there about this. Yes.
And John, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Just a few added reflections, really. I think it is clear that where you have complicated journeys of many legs and those kind of interchanges, that it does act as a deterrent to travel in some way. And I can remember early on in my railway career, when I still live in York, but my parents at the time lived in North Wales. And even though I was the beneficiary of staff travel arrangements, being a British Rail employee at the time, and therefore the cost of my journey was free, I wouldn't do it to myself in terms of going from York to Blaenau Ffestiniog by train because it was just too long and too complicated, and the fact that I might miss my connections or the last train up the Conwy Valley was just too much to contemplate. So so those things are obviously true. I note that as the industry comes together in terms of the priorities under GBR, one of the things that's being talked about by the new heads of the industry, the Andrew Hayneses and the Robin Gisbys and the Alex Hines of this world, is one of the priorities is restoring the integrity of the operational railway and the punctuality and the reliability with which the industry performs. And I think that is for sure an obvious place for them to go, but for the reasons that we've talked about, that may be slow to bring about improvement, but very necessary. And so then you sort of return to the, well, what are we to do in the meantime? And I suppose partly I speak as a former customer relations manager during my time in the railway, so I saw the impacts of all of this firsthand, but I still see the impacts of it today, which is the industry does quite a poor job of reassuring consumers that it has this obligation, if you've bought a train ticket, to get them to the final destination. And we still encounter on a day-to-day basis arguments between this train operator and that train operator and the customer about which train they did get on, and they had a split ticket, so therefore that it wasn't valid for a through journey, and all of these kind of nonsensical things that just really add to this overhead that the industry carries, that it's not a safe place to do business or for you to place your trust in because it's not reliable. And if something goes wrong, then you're going to be sort of slightly, hung out to dry and on your own. And so I think something I referred to earlier was the ability of retailers like Trainline to be able to offer delay repay to consumers, because I think that's a really important part of the service pledge that the industry makes to its customers. If it doesn't deliver it right, we should be able to help them get redress and to help them feel somewhat less injured by the experience. But I think a broader message about how the industry thinks about its consumer-facing responsibilities and how it will look after people in the event that things do go wrong, I think would be very welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, John. We have 2 minutes, and I'm hoping to close up by doing what is probably your nightmare and asking each of our panelists if you could see one change to the rail network in the UK over the next 5 years, what would you like it to be? Sorry to put you on the spot with that, but Stephen, I'll start with you, if that's all right.
Well, I think I wrote this for one of the rail magazines. Actually, I think we need to make the rail network boringly reliable, to expand it in the ways that people in the chat have been talking about, so it provides a good alternative for more car journeys, evenings and weekends as well as commuting, and that it's integrated with what the mayors are doing and devolved administrations are doing, and also in wider policies such as planning.
Fantastic answer on the spot. Thanks very much, Stephen. And John, I ask you the same.
Of course, and to build slightly on Stephen's point, and to build one that I made earlier, I referred at the start to the prominence of network benefits as being something that was very key when the industry was franchised 25, 30 years ago. And one of the hallmarks of that network benefits piece was the establishment of what was then the CCST ticket, the orange cardboard ticket, which was the universal token that enabled you to make any journey from any station to any other station on the network, including via London. And whilst London has a remarkable contactless pay-as-you-go infrastructure, the envy of the world, one of the things it has done is make London an island. It doesn't make through journeys very easy anymore. And I don't know what the answer is to a unified transit token across the country, and it could be a barcode token on a mobile phone in the way that we've been busy rolling out with the industry at Trainline, or it could be an ITSO on mobile token, or it could be a contactless payment token. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter as long as it's consumer friendly, designed by people who understand customers so that it works for customers, and it's ubiquitous across the piece. Oh, and by the way, affordable as well, because some of the technology implementations that we've looked at in retail are horrifically expensive. But yes, a simple, clear, affordable, unified transit token to get people across the country would be my ask.
Love the sound of that. And Crispin, can I ask you the same question, please?
Well, you probably know what my number one point would be, but assuming that making all fares drastically cheaper is just a little too much of a moonshot, I would settle for a means-tested rail card, and more cycle spaces, like Jonathan said in the chat. Definitely an advocate of more cycle spaces. And yes, integrated ticketing is great. That's another point. To add to the point about simplicity, I have a colleague who had to upgrade his entire phone because a company that will remain nameless upgraded their ticketing app, and it wasn't compatible with his old phone. So where's the affordability? Where's the sustainability in making people buy more devices to go through a barrier when it could be simpler? And I do approve the pay-as-you-go system and just swiping a card. So thank you.
Turned into a little bit of a wish list there from Crispin, but thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today as well, especially for Crispin's work on the project and for the support from FIT and I Came by Train and Trainline. And thank you very much all for watching today, and see you soon. Bye.